All right, good morning. So we're going to be talking through the reading guide for the Renaissance. So if you want to go up to your syllabus, we see that we need to do for Renaissance R4 through R7. All right, and we have our Renaissance. Okay, here we go. The Renaissance, 1450 to 1600, was a time of renewal, excitement, and freedom. This period was a contrast to the medieval era in which rhythmic music modes rarely deviated and had strict liturgical church texts. New and exciting timbres that came from combining voices and instruments in new and creative ways were appearing in the Renaissance. During this time, voices and instruments could be used on the same parts or in any way the conductor chose. Now, there weren't really conductors at this time, so be careful. Let's replace conductor with leader. For example, if a madrigal had 4 parts and the conductor only had 3 singers, an instrument would be used on the 4th part. All right, so let's go into our notes. Start with some fresh notes for Renaissance. So we've already been given the time period. So first thing to note that the change in time, think about how this is 150 years, whereas the medieval era was several hundred years, roughly 1,000 years, let's say. So progress as we go through time moves much quicker. It took about 1,000 years for the Renaissance to happen after the fall of Rome, and now to get from the Renaissance to the next period, it only took us 150 years. So progress is moving fast in Europe. So we know the Renaissance. Okay, so what did we learn in this first? So, a time of excitement and freedom. Okay, so we might call this a progressive time, which, progress, right? Progressive nowadays can mean a lot of things politically, but progress is a good thing. So we had voices and instruments, but the instruments had to play exactly what the voices. So the instrument was more, instruments were a substitute for voices. They weren't on their own yet. That happens later. Okay. Yep. Instruments played during the Renaissance were recorders, crumhorns, lutes, viols, and the portative organ. Percussion instruments such as small hand drums, tambourines, and finger cymbals were also used. Other than the church organ, the major keyboard instrument was the harpsichord, its earliest reference being 1397. The harpsichord was used both as a solo and accompanying instrument, and was distinguished from the clavichord or piano by the fact that the strings were plucked rather than struck. Similar instruments came into many shapes and sizes. The virginal, spinet, clavecin, and clavicembalo, each with a distinct sound due to the shape and string configuration. So here we're learning more about instruments. So we see that, so again, lutes, harpsichord, viols, which is sort of like a cello. It's kind of like a cello. Okay, and percussion were used. Now we get this in a big box, right? So anything that's in bold or a big box is something we really want to pay attention to. The male soprano voice was the most important and significant new tone color of the Renaissance. So the important word is new. All right, so we had talked about in the medieval unit that men and boys were allowed to sing in the church. So what happened was they started to write soprano parts, right? So the soprano voice became very popular. But women couldn't sing that part. So boys, let's say highly skilled boys, sung that high part. All right, so we still have men and boys choirs today, and you know, in our current society, you know, we do want to, you know, have equality amongst boys and girls. Certainly girls can sing the same way as boys. So when we see men and boys choirs, they're not doing that to exclude girls and women. They're trying to go for a more authentic sound for some of this music. And, you know, it's not particularly a popular thing. And in fact, in England, where this was pretty popular, a lot of men and boys choirs have actually started auditioning girls. And it's very common for choirs to have men and women. So those few specialized groups that use only men and boys are just doing a very specific thing, which is not to be exclusive, but rather to be a little bit more faithful to the tradition. All right. While secular choral music was written to be performed for the courts of the European royal families or guests at special events, sacred choral music was created and performed for the churches, each church or cathedral wanting to have the finest music for their services. Throughout the Renaissance, women were forbidden to sing in the Catholic Church. Only males were permitted to sing. Boys with unchanged voices sang the two highest vocal lines, the soprano and alto, and men sang the lower tenor and bass voices. For example, the Sistine Chapel at St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican allowed only males to sing in its choir. Boys began their careers as choir boys and typically became choir members, composers, and conductors. Competition for the finest choir became so competitive that it was rumored that the famous child singer Orlando di Lasso was kidnapped twice by jealous priests because he was such an outstanding boy singer. So we've got some terms now. So let's start our terms list. So we know that the Renaissance is going to be a term, right? Renaissance era. We know that harpsichord is going to be in there. And we know that, let's say, boy soprano, right? That's a special thing to talk about. But then we just also have the voice parts, right? You need to know what the voice parts are: soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. So we know that this era is that. Harpsichord was a new keyboard instrument. Harpsichord is not a piano. So boy soprano, we already know we can say most popular voice in Renaissance. Soprano just means high, high treble, low treble, say high male, say adult, low male adult. And of course, I use the word treble here because men and women can both sing these parts. It's just that in the church they weren't allowed to. But if you were outside of the church, you could do that. So we have two very distinct, in this paragraph, two very distinct things happening. So we have the church sacred music was performed for, obviously, the church. But the secular or non-sacred music, who was that for? That was for the nobles and princes and kings, the courts. Call that the court. So we have court and church. So as I talked about a little bit in the medieval lecture, the court and the church were like the left and right hand of all the power and riches and safety. So, and of course they valued, the church valued its music because it was a form of prayer, and the secular courts wanted music because you have to remember, this is a time when there were no iPads, there was no TikTok, there was no internet, no movie theaters, no Netflix. Unbelievable, right? So the major form of entertainment, I'll write this down. The major form of entertainment was music and dancing. So if you wanted to have fun, especially if you had money and you were powerful and you wanted to have fun with your friends, you would play music and you would dance. Okay? Feasts were also common. And a feast is, if you want to see what a feast is like, come to madrigals, because that's essentially what we're doing in a feast. It's a lot of great food and storytelling, and I guess I shouldn't cheapskate, I guess poetry and comedy, like a jester would be. So music, poetry, comedy, and dancing. So those were kind of your major forms of entertainment during this time. All right. The use of instruments was prohibited in the Sistine Chapel, thus all music was sung a cappella without the use of instruments or organ. So a cappella literally means as in the chapel. So a cappella is going to be a term for us. A cappella means no instruments or without instruments. The vocal sounds of the Renaissance contain tension that was produced by singers with partially closed mouths. This is obvious from viewing paintings of singers during this musical period. Vibrato in the voices was considered an undesirable trait during the Renaissance. In his writing of the period, Thurston Dart states that little or no vibrato should be sung when singing Renaissance choral literature. I don't think there's a whole lot to say about that. I will say that paintings can be deceiving. So we're just going to move on. Secular choir music became important in all the royal courts of Europe during this time. Choral music of 3, 4, or more parts was sung by members of the court. Musicians could also be members of the court, right? But most people that were well educated could sing or play an instrument or both. Many times servants were hired to work in the courts because of their singing ability. If the lord of the manor was a bass, then a male servant was hired to sing tenor and a female servant to sing the part of the lady of the house, the part that the lady of the house did not sing. So they're kind of going for 4 voice parts: soprano, alto, tenor, bass. We've already kind of talked about the courts, so I think we're good there. The evening's entertainment after a bountiful dinner, that would be like the feast, featured the royal court and selected servants sitting around the banquet table and singing secular songs. Remember, secular is non-religious. This was at the beginning of madrigal feasts, Yuletide feasts, or Renaissance dinners. As their popularity grew, all the royal courts wanted this new form of entertainment. Even the lesser lords felt that they needed music after dinner. Composers were hired by the courts to create and perform music during the feasts. On special feast days, the composers were well paid and were provided housing. So we've kind of covered all of that already. So we've sort of talked about all that, right? I don't know that there's a whole lot to add. Again, not trying to make this so difficult. All right, the term madrigal refers to a new poetic form in the 16th century. Known by its freedom and irregularity, the madrigal typically had 4 to 6 voices and often was an elaborate composition that contained word painting. Word painting is where the text is depicted by visual image, and complex vocal lines. So word painting would be like if I was singing Surgite, to rise up, and I went Surgite, right, like that. So the vocal line is rising, and then the word is rising. That would be the music, and the text are kind of doing the same thing. So that's what word painting does. Madrigal was a term used in England and Italy for this type of musical composition, but was referred to as chanson in French and Lied in Germany. But so all of Europe was kind of doing its own thing with these songs. All right, here's a big one. The invention of the printing press was one of the most important advances of the period. It gave composers a precise way of duplicating their compositions. Prior to that, all books and music had to be hand copied. Music could now be produced much faster and in greater quantities. So the major invention, and this changes a lot of things, is the printing press. The printing press changes everything because the written word is now more accessible. So prior to the printing press, so there's the printing press and then there's paper, right? So what you used to have to do in the medieval period is you would have to have usually a bunch of monks. Monks were mostly the people who were writing books, and you would hand write a book, and then the paper that you would use would be called vellum, and vellum is actually sheep or lamb skin. And so what they would do is they would have to, there's no paper, and so what they would have to do is they would have these livestock, sheep, lamb, and they would kill the animal and use its skin as the paper. Now you might notice that the modern paper that we use, which is made out of basically trees, for lack of a better, I'm not going to get into how paper is made, but let's just say it's made out of trees or it's recycled. It doesn't hold up very well. Vellum, on the other hand, since it's actually basically leather, vellum lasts a very long time, and but it was also very expensive, right? Because chopping down a tree and producing that into a bunch of paper, although maybe not sustainable, it's much cheaper. But so anyway, this was incredibly expensive. Only the richest of Europe could afford a book, a single book, because you'd have to have a bunch of people handwriting every letter of every page, and then you had to have X amount of sheep and lambs to actually have the paper or the pages. So now with the printing press, we're getting more paper. I think they still used vellum, but again, that would be just almost like a status thing because you're just super rich. Most people were trying to make books that were more affordable, and so and of course the most published book, I think this is still true, but certainly in the Renaissance, the most published book was the Bible. So the written word was very, very important, and of course this affects music as well because we have things that don't have to just be handwritten; they can now be printed. Okay, so I hope that is pretty clear. Okay, what was happening in America during the Renaissance? The earliest known inhabitants of the United States were Native Americans who played the first music in this land. Music from this time was sung almost entirely on one part or unison. So that's very similar to our chant, our Gregorian chant, right? That's what we would call monophonic. Instruments used during this period were drums and flutes made out of bone, wood, and cane. Because the length of the flutes was not uniform, the pitch of each instrument was different. So the length of your flute or the length of your recorder changes the pitch. So in order to play together, you have to have similar lengths. If it's a short length, it's going to be higher. If it's a longer length, it's going to be lower. Therefore, usually only one flute was used at a time to avoid conflicting pitches. That makes sense. During the Renaissance, Christopher Columbus led his 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, across the ocean. They arrived in Americas, or as what was called the New World, on October 11th, 1492. So, we know a little bit of our U.S. history, American history, world history. 1492 is the date that we're kind of used to, right? 1492, sailed the ocean blue, right? Let's think about where 1492 is in our Renaissance, right? So this all happened after the medieval period, and we have many European powers who are trying to get to the East. They thought they were trying to get to India, and because traveling by land was dangerous in other ways. Traveling by sea was also very dangerous, but they were trying to find a quicker way. And finally, this is just a kind of an interesting little chronology, just for your own. Let's see, there's a couple things. So yes, okay. So we have the printing press. Renaissance begins shortly after the printing press. Dracula. Okay, then we have 1492. Okay, and you see very, very quickly we get our first complete song collection that's printed. Okay, good. We got some art things here. Okay, some major cathedrals are starting to be built. Okay. We have King of England, Henry VIII. First African slaves arrive in the Americas. Okay. You just kind of read this. An interesting little side note, I actually went to DeSoto Falls, which is in northern Alabama this summer, and I actually got to see DeSoto Falls. Hernando de Soto discovered these falls, and I was actually there. Pretty cool. Queen of England. Oh my goodness, the lead pencil is invented. How old is that? And Florida is founded. Get somebody to circumnavigate the entire world. Pretty cool stuff. All right. Let's see if there's anything else we need to add. So in terms of Renaissance life, I like to give a little history. So in Renaissance life, we're pretty much in a similar situation to the medieval period, except for nobles, nobles, and a kind of new rich class, the tradesmen, people who trade, tradesmen, become richer. And so what ends up happening is that this is important to the church because the church gets donated a lot of money from tradesmen on their deathbeds. So whether it's secular or sacred, at this time the church and the belief, especially in Christianity, but also Judaism is very popular in Europe, but mostly we're talking about Christians. This idea that a rich person has a difficult time getting into heaven. So we'll say they believed that a rich person would have a difficult time getting into heaven. And so what they would do is these rich people would put into their wills, or the legal documents about their sort of surrounding their death, they would donate all of their riches to the church upon their death. And so because of this belief, the church did accumulate a lot of riches, but mostly what was important was the land. Land is so important because you can grow crops on it, and you can grow wine and all kinds of things. So I mean, yeah, sure. Did they get some cool artifacts? Maybe, yeah, sure. But mostly it was the land and coins. Land and coin. And so you had a lot of these rich tradespeople. The other thing that these tradesmen types would do, they would, so there were a couple laws about inheritance. So tradesmen could, let's say generally, would only be allowed to, I think bequeath is the term here, but only allowed to give their firstborn son most of their riches and wealth. This meant that the fourth, fifth, and sixth child, because people had big families back then, might be donated to the church as monks, priests, nuns, and other religious. So why do this? So this is actually, you might be thinking, oh my goodness, they just gave away their child to the church? That's horrible. You have to remember that it was again, kind of a horrible time. And so what people would do is they would say, okay, well, I really am only going to be able to give my firstborn son all of my wealth. Well, what does that mean for the rest of my children? And so actually, given the system, given the world that they lived in, donating or sort of giving your child to the church, knowing full well that they wouldn't be able to support themselves with your inheritance, giving them to the church actually ensured that they would be protected and that they would have a purpose and that they would likely live a long and healthy life. Because again, as I've said in other lectures, this idea that to live out on the street or be alone or be a farmer could be very dangerous, especially if you don't have a lord or someone very powerful protecting you. So if you were a part of the church, you had a place to sleep, you had food, you had wine. Remember water, I keep mentioning wine. That's because the water wasn't really drinkable at this time. You'd get sick if you drank the water. So they oftentimes drank beer or wine. That was just kind of a reality of the time. And so by donating their son or daughter to the church, they were actually improving their child's station in life and trying to help them. So it wasn't that they didn't love them or didn't want them, but given the way that the world worked, that was one way that a mother or father could choose to protect their children. So that was another thing. So this, of course, meant that the church never really had too much problem having priests and monks and nuns, and they didn't have a lot of trouble with money. because you had a lot of this rich merchant class, these tradesmen, donating to the church and increasing the wealth of the church. And then, of course, the in the court system with the kings, queens, dukes, and lords and ladies, they they were also still doing kind of the same things in the medieval period, going to war with one another, um, protecting the farmers, protecting, knights would go and make sure that the roads were safe from robbers. And so a lot of that is still happening. And so important people, if they were traveling long distances, they would have to go with a huge caravan, and musicians would be a part of that, and jesters, but also all the knights and archers and fighters to make sure that they would be protected. So I think that pretty much covers our Renaissance. We're going to come back to this terms list when we start to talk about the music, but in terms of the reading guide, that will take care of it. So again, thank you very much.